On a cold October evening in 2005, an 11-year-old girl named Lily Sorenson climbed into a sleeping bag on her best friend's bedroom floor, giggling about a movie they'd just watched, and was never seen again. Police searched the house. They searched the neighborhood. They searched the lake that sat just beyond the tree line, its surface already skinned with the season's first thin ice. Nothing. No witnesses. No evidence. No sign that a window had been forced. No sign that anyone had climbed in or out. The case went cold within 18 months. Detectives retired. Reporters moved on to other tragedies. 18 years later, a DNA match uploaded by a stranger to a public genealogy website would blow the entire case wide open, revealing a secret so carefully hidden that even the people closest to Lily Sorenson had spent nearly 2 decades believing a lie. What investigators uncovered next shocked everyone. Before we continue, if you enjoy mysteries, cold cases, and shocking investigations, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another mystery. Now, let's get into today's story. Hollow Pine was a small lake town in northern Minnesota, the kind of place where summer brought tourists to rent cabins along the shoreline and winter shrank the population down to the few thousand people who called it home year-round. A town built around a single main street with a hardware store, a diner, a Lutheran church, and an elementary school small enough that every teacher knew every student's name by the second week of the school year. The lake itself dominated the town's identity in every season. Docks and boat launches lining most of its accessible shoreline. Ice fishing shanties dotting its frozen surface every winter like a small, temporary village, and generations of Hollow Pine children learning to swim in its cold, clear water before they learned much of anything else. It was the kind of town where a missing child felt less like a news story and more like a wound in the body of the community itself, something every resident carried, whether or not they had ever personally met the Sorenson family. Lily Sorenson had grown up there her whole life, in a modest ranch house 3 streets back from the water, raised by her mother, Karen, after Lily's biological father had, according to everything Lily had ever been told, simply walked out on the family when she was 2 years old and never looked back. Karen worked as a bookkeeper for 3 small businesses in town, the kind of job that let her be home by 4 every afternoon, and had remarried when Lily was 7 to a steady, soft-spoken man named Mark Doyle, who owned the hardware store on Hollow Pine's single commercial street and who Lily had, by every account from neighbors and teachers alike, come to love completely, calling him Dad without any hesitation by the time she turned 9. Karen had grown up 200 miles south in a river town she rarely talked about and had moved to Hollow Pine at 23 with an infant daughter and a story about a husband who'd left them both behind. A story she told with such practiced, weary consistency that nobody in town ever thought to question it, not even her own mother, who visited twice a year and always changed the subject the moment Karen's first marriage came up. Karen built a quiet, careful life out of that story, working her way up from a part-time filing clerk to keeping the books for 3 of the town's small businesses, earning a reputation as meticulous, reliable, and just private enough that people respected the boundary without ever quite naming it. She kept a framed photo of Lily as a newborn on her nightstand and, curiously, nothing at all from before Lily's birth. A detail neighbors sometimes noticed and attributed to heartbreak rather than to anything more complicated. She rarely drank more than a single glass of wine at gatherings, rarely left town even for a weekend, and kept a small, worn address book in a locked drawer of her desk that she never once mentioned to anyone, not even Mark, a detail that would mean nothing to investigators in 2005 and everything to them 18 years later. Lily's 4th-grade teacher, Patricia Hollis, would later describe her as a child who asked questions other students didn't think to ask, wondering out loud once during a lesson on the water cycle whether a person could disappear the same way water does, evaporating into something invisible rather than gone. A comment Patricia had found charmingly strange at the time and would think about very differently, once she learned, nearly 2 decades later, exactly how prophetic it had turned out to be. Lily's telescope, a birthday gift from Mark the year she turned 9, sat angled permanently toward a patch of sky she'd mapped out herself using a library book on constellations, and neighbors passing the Sorenson house on clear nights sometimes saw her silhouette in the window, perfectly still, watching stars that had, in some cases, burned out millions of years before she was ever born. A detail her mother liked to tell her with a kind of quiet wonder that Lily never tired of hearing. Lily was 11 years old that October, a quiet, imaginative child who kept a telescope by her bedroom window and could name every visible constellation by the time she was 8, taught to her by a science teacher who called her one of the most curious students she'd ever had. She loved swimming in the lake until the water turned too cold to bear it, loved reading fantasy novels 2 grade levels above her own, kept a journal she filled with lists of star names and half-finished stories about explorers, and had, that autumn, developed the kind of intense, all-consuming best friendship 11-year-old girls sometimes form with a classmate named Maddie Voss who lived 4 streets over in a slightly larger house with a trampoline in the backyard and 2 older brothers who mostly ignored both girls except to tease them. Maddie and Lily had sleepovers nearly every other weekend that fall, the kind of ordinary, joyful ritual that neither family thought twice about, popcorn and rented movies, and whispered secrets long after they were supposed to be asleep. Lily's classmates would later describe her as the kind of kid who noticed things other kids didn't bother noticing, the exact shade the sky turned before a storm, the particular way ice sounded when it first formed on the edges of the lake each November, small observations she recorded faithfully in her journal alongside the star charts, a habit of attention that her mother liked to say meant Lily was destined to become either a scientist or a poet, and privately hoped, quietly, that she'd somehow manage to become both. Mark Doyle had built a reputation in Hollow Pine as a dependable, quietly generous man, the kind who extended credit to families who couldn't quite make rent that month and never mentioned it again, who sponsored the Youth Soccer League's uniforms 3 years running, who neighbors described, without exception, as the last person on earth they'd ever suspect of anything. He'd married Karen 4 years earlier in a small ceremony at the town's Lutheran church and had, by every account, worked hard and patiently to earn Lily's trust rather than assume it, letting her set the pace of their relationship until, somewhere around her 9th birthday, she'd started calling him Dad without any prompting at all, a moment Mark would later describe, before he knew the full truth, of what came after, as the proudest of his entire life. He kept a small notebook tucked in his nightstand drawer, one Karen only ever glimpsed by accident, in which he'd recorded, in careful handwriting, every small milestone of Lily's childhood he'd been present for. Her first lost tooth, the day she learned to ride a bike without training wheels, the exact words she'd used the first time she called him Dad, a private accounting of fatherhood he never showed to anyone, treating those small, ordinary moments with the same careful reverence most people reserve for things they're afraid might not last. The Voss family lived in a 2-story house on Larkspur Lane, close enough to the lake that Roger Voss, Maddie's father, kept a small aluminum boat tied to a dock at the end of their backyard, more for weekend fishing than anything else, its green tarp cover snapping softly in the autumn wind most evenings. Denise Voss, Maddie's mother, taught 4th grade at the elementary school and had, that October evening, made the girls a pan of homemade brownies before leaving them to their movie and heading upstairs herself around 10 to read in bed. A detail she would repeat to investigators so many times over the following months that she began to dream about it. She later admitted, word for word, the way you dream about something you've said out loud so many times it stops feeling like memory and starts feeling like performance. The girls had watched an animated movie about a lost dog finding its way home, Denise recalled, both of them still in their pajamas from the moment they arrived, curled together under a shared blanket on the living room floor while the television threw flickering blue light across the walls. The kind of scene so ordinary it would have vanished from anyone's memory entirely if it hadn't become, within hours, the last known image anyone had of Lily Sorenson alive. The Voss household that particular fall was, by every neighbor's account, an unremarkable one, the kind of comfortably busy family life that draws no special notice. Dinner most nights around 6, Homework spread across the kitchen table, a dog named Biscuit who greeted every visitor with the same indiscriminate enthusiasm. Denise and Karen had known each other since their own school days, close enough friends that Denise had been one of only a handful of people Karen invited to her second wedding. And it was that long, easy familiarity, more than anything else, that made the sleepover such an automatic, unremarkable arrangement between the two families, the kind of standing trust built over decades that made anyone slower. To imagine anything sinister happening inside that particular house, on that particular street, to that particular child. Maddie's older brother, Corey, 19 that fall and living at home while he worked at a boat repair shop on the far side of the lake, had come home just after 11 that night, letting himself in through the garage the way he always did to avoid waking anyone, and would later tell police he hadn't heard or seen anything unusual, though he admitted, uncomfortably, under repeated questioning, that he'd been drinking with friends earlier that evening and couldn't account for a full hour of his own night with any real precision, a gap in his memory that would follow him through years of suspicion he never fully managed to shake. His younger brother, 16-year-old Tyler Voss, had been asleep in his own room down the hall the entire night, according to his own account and a set of texts to a friend time-stamped just after midnight that placed his phone, and presumably him, firmly inside the house. Denise Voss woke just after 6 the next morning to make coffee and found Maddie's bedroom door open, the sleeping bags on the floor, one still zipped shut with a pillow tucked inside it, the other empty, flattened, as if someone had simply stood up and walked away in the middle of the night without disturbing the fabric around them. Maddie was still asleep in her own bed, having climbed up out of the sleeping bag sometime after midnight the way she always did, too restless to sleep on the floor all night, a habit her parents knew well and thought nothing of. Lily was gone. Her shoes, still by the back door where both girls had left them the evening before, remained untouched, laces still tied the way she'd left them. Her backpack, packed for the sleepover, sat exactly where she'd left it against the wall, unzipped, a folded change of clothes still inside, a hairbrush resting on top exactly as her mother had packed it the morning before. The bedroom window was closed and locked from the inside, a detail that would puzzle investigators for the better part of 2 decades, because if Lily had left through that door, she would have had to pass directly by Denise and Roger's bedroom, down a flight of stairs that creaked loudly enough to wake the whole house on ordinary nights, and out through a back door that had, according to Roger, been bolted the night before and remained bolted when he checked it that same morning. Denise stood frozen in the doorway for what she would later describe as an impossibly long moment, the brownie pan still cooling on the kitchen counter downstairs, the television remote still resting exactly where Lily had left it the night before, everything in the house arranged with the eerie, undisturbed stillness of a room that had simply lost one of its occupants without any accompanying evidence of struggle, noise, or departure. She checked the bathroom. She checked the hall closet. She woke Roger, whose first instinct, groggy and disbelieving, was to assume Lily had simply wandered downstairs early for a snack, an assumption that lasted only as long as it took him to walk the length of the house himself and find no trace of the girl anywhere inside it. Maddie, roused from her bed and asked, gently, where Lily might have gone, blinked at her mother with the confused, unbothered innocence of a child who had genuinely slept through whatever had happened, insisting over and over that Lily had been right there, curled in her sleeping bag, when Maddie had climbed up into her own bed sometime after midnight. Denise called Karen Sorenson at 6:15 that morning in a voice Karen would later recall, so strange and controlled, that Karen knew something was wrong before Denise even finished her sentence, a flatness to her tone that felt entirely unlike the warm, easy woman Karen had known for years. Within 20 minutes, Karen and Mark were standing in the Voss family's driveway in their pajamas, Karen's bare feet stuffed hastily into a pair of Mark's boots, her breath coming in short, visible clouds in the cold morning air as she called Lily's name toward a house that had, hours earlier, seemed like the safest place in the world for her daughter to be. Within the hour, half the Hollow Pine Police Department, all 4 officers on duty that Saturday morning, were combing through a house that had, as far as anyone could tell, simply let a child slip out of it without a single sound, a locked window, and a bolted door standing between the girl and the outside world exactly as they had the night before. Word moved through Hollow Pine the way it moves through any small town, fast and distorted. By the time the first search parties assembled at the elementary school parking lot that afternoon, half the rumors already circulating had nothing to do with anything that had actually happened. The sheriff at the time, a heavyset, methodical man named Tom Whitaker, who had worked in Hollow Pine for 22 years and had never handled anything more serious than the occasional break-in at a summer cabin, stood at the center of that parking lot in a flannel jacket, watching nearly 300 volunteers organize themselves into search lines that stretched from the Voss property all the way, down to the public boat launch a mile away, the air sharp with the smell of dead leaves and distant wood smoke. The lake beyond them, the color of pewter under a sky already threatening the season's first real snow. Divers were called in from the county seat by noon, cutting through water that had already dropped into the low 40s, checking the shallows near the Voss dock first, then working outward in slow, methodical grids that took the better part of 4 days, their yellow dry suits stark against the gray water, volunteers watching from the shoreline in silence broken only by the occasional crackle of a search radio. They found nothing. Nobody. No clothing. No sign that anyone, child or otherwise, had entered that lake at all. Search dogs were brought in the following morning, and it was here that the case took its first genuinely strange turn. The lead handler, a state trooper named Diane Kowalski, who had worked search and rescue across 3 counties for over a decade, ran her bloodhound from Lily's sleeping bag out through the house, and the dog picked up a clear trail leading directly to the Voss family's back door, out onto the dock, and then stopped, dead, at the very edge of the water, refusing to go further, circling twice, whining, low in its throat, the same way search dogs sometimes do at a scent that simply ends without explanation, ears pinned back, tail low, an animal clearly troubled by something it had no way to communicate beyond its own unmistakable body language. Kowalski would say for years afterward that she had never seen a trail behave quite like that one. A clean, confident scent line that simply terminated at the water's edge, as though the person who left it had either gone into the lake or been lifted directly off that dock into something that left no further trace at all. A boat, perhaps, though Roger Voss's own boat sat undisturbed at that same dock. Its cover still buckled down exactly as he'd left it 2 days before, dew collecting undisturbed on the canvas in a way that made clear nobody had touched it in some time. A second handler, brought in from a neighboring county on the 3rd day out of sheer desperation, ran an entirely different dog along the same path and got the identical result, the animal balking at the same spot on the dock, a detail that ruled out handler error or a single dog's confusion and left investigators with a scent trail that behaved, in Kowalski's own words to a reporter years later, like something had been trying very hard to look like a drowning without actually being one. But investigators would soon discover that wasn't even the strangest part. 3 days into the search, a teenager kayaking along the far shore of the lake, nearly 1.5 miles from the Voss property, found a single flip-flop wedged between 2 rocks at the waterline. Small, child-sized, patterned with a cartoon starfish that Karen Sorenson confirmed, hands shaking as she held it, matched a pair Lily had worn to the beach that summer, though notably not the shoes Lily had actually worn to the sleepover, which remained accounted for by the Voss family's back door. The teenager, a 17-year-old named Josh Fenner, who had been paddling that stretch of shoreline purely for the exercise, would later tell reporters he'd nearly paddled right past it, catching only a flash of red plastic against the gray rock in his peripheral vision, a detail that if he'd been 10 feet further out on the water might have gone unnoticed for weeks, months, possibly forever, a small, accidental discovery that ended up anchoring an entire county's understanding of the case for the next 18 years. The flip-flop's presence made no clean sense to anyone. It hadn't been part of what Lily wore that night. It had no water damage, consistent with drifting 1.5 miles across an open lake, no algae growth, nothing that suggested it had been submerged for 3 days at all. Forensic examiners flown in from the state crime lab in St. Paul would later describe the shoe's condition as almost suspiciously clean, preserved, as if it had been placed at that exact spot rather than carried there by wind or current, a detail that would sit, unresolved and unexplained, in the case file for the next 18 years, one more breadcrumb pointing everyone in exactly the wrong direction, while the truth moved quietly somewhere else entirely. Sheriff Whitaker's small department, overwhelmed by a case far larger than anything they'd ever trained for, brought in state investigators within the first week, and together they canvassed nearly 60 households within a 2-mile radius of the Voss property, knocking on doors long after most residents had already spoken to volunteers or reporters, asking the same handful of questions again and again, in the hope that repetition might jar loose some detail nobody realized mattered. A man walking his dog reported headlights idling at the end of a nearby cul-de-sac sometime after midnight, a detail that led nowhere once the vehicle turned out to belong to a teenager sneaking home past curfew from an entirely unrelated party. A woman 2 streets over reported hearing what she thought might have been a car door somewhere around 1 in the morning, though she couldn't say with any confidence whether she'd actually heard it or simply dreamed it after being asked so many times to remember. Every lead, however small, was logged, chased, and eventually closed. The investigation's early weeks were defined less by any single dramatic discovery than by the slow, exhausting accumulation of near misses that led nowhere at all. The investigation, in its early weeks, turned first toward Corey Voss, the 19-year-old brother home that night with an hour of his evening he couldn't fully account for. Detectives pulled his phone records and found a string of calls to a number that turned out to belong to a small-time marijuana supplier 2 towns over, a discovery that sent Sheriff Whitaker's small department into a frenzy of speculation that Corey had somehow been involved in something far darker than recreational drug use, perhaps owing money to people who might use a child as leverage against. A family with no obvious connection to organized crime at all, an idea that seemed far-fetched even to the detectives chasing it, but that nobody could afford to dismiss outright given the total absence of any better theory. Corey was questioned 4 times over the following 2 months, his truck searched twice, his known associates interviewed at length, each new lead swallowing days of investigative time before collapsing under its own weight. The theory collapsed entirely when the supplier, facing his own separate charges, confirmed under oath that his entire relationship with Corey began and ended with small cash transactions for personal use, nothing more, and that he'd never met Lily Sorenson, never heard her name, and had no reason on earth to want anything to do with a missing child case that had brought half the county's law enforcement down on everyone even loosely connected to the Voss family. Corey would carry the weight of that suspicion for years afterward, moving away from Hollow Pine in 2009 after, he said, growing tired of walking into the hardware store or the gas station and feeling every eye in the room follow him, a low, constant hum of unspoken accusation that never fully lifted no matter how many times the sheriff's department publicly cleared him. He would tell a reporter, years later, that the worst part hadn't been the questioning itself, but the birthday party he wasn't invited to that spring, a neighbor's child turning 10, an invitation that had come to every other family on the street except his, a small, silent verdict delivered by people who never said a single accusing word to his face. Mark Doyle, Lily's stepfather, became the subject of a different kind of scrutiny once investigators discovered a life insurance policy Mark had taken out on Lily 2 years earlier, a modest $25,000 policy that Karen explained, when questioned, had been part of a broader financial planning package their insurance agent had recommended for the whole family, including matching policies, on both herself and Mark that predated Lily's by nearly a decade. The agent corroborated Karen's account down to the paperwork, producing signed forms and dated correspondence that left no room for doubt, and Mark's financial records showed no unusual debts, no gambling problems, nothing that suggested a man desperate enough to harm a child he'd raised as his own for 4 years for the sake of a payout that wouldn't have covered much more than a modest funeral. Still, for a season, the whispers followed him too. Customers quietly taking their hardware business to the next town over rather than look Mark Doyle in the eye. A silent, unspoken accusation that cost him nearly a third of his income before the town, slowly began to remember who he actually was, a process that took the better part of 2 years and that Mark never once complained about publicly, absorbing the suspicion the way he seemed to absorb every other burden that came with loving a child who had vanished. Sheriff Whitaker's own notes from that period, recovered nearly 2 decades later, describe Mark as cooperative to the point of exhaustion, showing up at the sheriff's office unprompted every few days simply to ask if there was anything at all, he could do. a question that eventually stopped being about information and became, in its own quiet way, a kind of grief nobody knew how to answer. A third name surfaced within the first month. A registered offender named Walter Pruitt, who lived alone in a cabin less than 2 miles from the Voss property, and who had, according to 2 separate neighbors, been seen walking near the lake on multiple evenings that fall. Pruitt became, for nearly 3 weeks, the town's presumed monster. His cabin watched around the clock by volunteers who took turns parked at the end of his gravel driveway in lawn chairs and thermoses of coffee. His mail intercepted twice by people convinced he was somehow communicating with an accomplice. His old truck followed on 2 separate occasions by teenagers who thought themselves amateur detectives. Cell tower data, painstakingly requested and finally delivered 6 weeks into the investigation, placed Pruitt's phone at his sister's house nearly 90 miles away for the entire weekend of the disappearance, a fact that did little to fully clear him in the court of public opinion even after Sheriff Whitaker announced it publicly, precisely the kind of stubborn, misplaced suspicion that clings to a small town long after the facts have moved on, following Pruitt until he eventually sold his cabin in 2007 and left Hollow Pine for good, telling the one reporter who asked that he'd rather live somewhere no one knew his name at all than keep waking up to find his mailbox knocked over for a crime he had absolutely nothing to do with. A fourth thread, quieter than the others, but no less consuming for the detectives who chased it, involved a substitute teacher named Ellis Grant, who had covered 2 weeks of Lily's 4th grade class earlier that fall while Patricia Hollis recovered from surgery, and who several parents recalled as unusually attentive to Lily specifically, keeping her after class more than once to discuss a book report, praising her curiosity in a way that struck at least one parent, in hindsight, as slightly too particular. Grant had left the district for an unrelated teaching position out of state before the disappearance even occurred, a timeline that ruled him out almost immediately once verified, his new school's attendance records placing him firmly in a classroom 400 miles away on the night in question, but not before investigators spent nearly 2 weeks tracking down his employment history, his references, and every family he'd had any contact with in 3 different school districts, a thread that taught Sheriff Whitaker's exhausted department nothing except how many innocent explanations a case can generate before it produces a single useful one. If you're enjoying this investigation so far, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It really helps the channel continue bringing you stories like this. Now let's continue, because what investigators uncovered next was even more disturbing. The case sat cold for the better part of 18 years, the way cases do, not through any single failure, but through the slow accumulation of dead ends and a public attention span that could not sustain itself against the total absence of new information. Sheriff Whitaker retired in 2011, telling a local reporter at his retirement dinner that the Sorenson case was the one file he still thought about at 2 in the morning. The one he'd never been able to make peace with closing unsolved, a confession that drew a long, uncomfortable silence from the room before someone finally changed the subject to easier memories. Karen and Mark Doyle's marriage, which had seemed unshakable to the entire town before the disappearance, began fraying within 2 years. The strain of raising a question mark instead of a daughter eroding something between them that neither could quite name, arguments erupting over nothing at all, silences stretching longer across the dinner table, and they separated quietly in 2008, divorcing the following year, though both stayed in Hollow Pine, an uneasy, grief-bound proximity that neither ever fully explained to friends who assumed, reasonably, that unbearable loss simply breaks some marriages the way it strengthens others. Karen kept Lily's bedroom exactly as it had been, the telescope still angled toward the window, dust gathering on a shelf of paperback novels Lily would never finish, and made a habit, for years, of updating a small folder of information for the Hollow Pine Police Department every time a new forensic technique became available nationally, requesting comparisons against updated missing persons databases that never returned a match. A ritual she performed alone every autumn around the anniversary of the disappearance, sitting at her kitchen table long after dark with a folder of hope that never once yielded an answer. What no one, not even Mark, ever noticed was that Karen made one additional phone call every autumn as well, always from a payphone 2 towns over rather than her own line. A call she logged nowhere and mentioned to no one, dialing a number she had long since memorized, waiting through 3 rings before someone on the other end simply said, "She's fine," and hung up, a ritual of its own that Karen carried in total isolation for nearly 2 decades. Mark Doyle never remarried, running the hardware store quietly for another decade, keeping a photograph of Lily behind the register that customers learned not to comment on unless he brought it up first. A small, careful shrine that softened over the years from raw grief into something closer to quiet, permanent tenderness. He coached the same youth soccer league he'd always sponsored, mentored a handful of teenagers who worked summers at his store, and told anyone who asked that he still believed, somewhere in his chest where logic didn't quite reach, that Lily was alive, a belief he could never explain, and eventually stopped trying to justify to people who looked at him with the particular, pitying patience reserved for grieving parents who haven't yet accepted reality. A retired detective named Rachel Osei, who had worked the periphery of the original investigation as a young officer fresh out of the academy before transferring to a larger department 2 hours south, kept an informal copy of the case notes in a drawer at home for years, running her own quiet checks against national databases on slow afternoons, never quite able to let go of a case that had haunted. The very first year of her career, a case she would later say taught her more about the limits of investigative work than anything she'd learned since. The investigation widened in those quiet intervening years to touch people who had never expected to be pulled into it at all. Maddie Voss, grown into an adult by the time DNA technology finally reopened the case, had spent nearly 2 decades believing in some private, unspoken corner of herself that her own restlessness that night, climbing out of her sleeping bag sometime after midnight the way she always did, might somehow have mattered, might have been the difference between waking beside her best friend and waking to an empty room, a guilt she never fully discussed with anyone until a therapist, years later, gently helped her understand that an 11-year-old's restless sleep habits could not possibly bear the weight she'd assigned them. Maddie married young, had 2 children of her own, and would later say the hardest part of raising daughters through their own sleepover years was the particular, private terror she carried every single time, a fear she never once explained to her own husband because she didn't know how to make the explanation sound like anything other than irrational grief dressed up as caution. Lily's 4th-grade teacher, a woman named Patricia Hollis, who had once written on a report card that Lily possessed one of the most curious minds she'd ever taught, kept a photograph of that year's class on her refrigerator for the rest of her career, unable to look at it without her eyes finding Lily's face first, every single time, a small, private ritual of remembrance she performed at breakfast. Most mornings for nearly 2 decades without ever telling a single colleague why that particular class photo, out of 31 years of teaching, was the one she couldn't bring herself to take down. Even a boy Lily had once had an awkward, giggly playground crush on, a detail unearthed only when Rachel Osei re-interviewed nearly everyone connected to the 5th-grade class years later, was tracked down as a grown man in his 30s, bewildered to learn that a piece of his own forgotten childhood had somehow become a footnote in a federal investigation he'd never imagined touching his life again. Laughing, uncomfortably, when Rachel explained why she needed to ask him a handful of questions about a girl he hadn't thought about in 15 years. A name from Karen's own past surfaced briefly during the original investigation as well, a man named Ray Talbot, whom Karen had dated briefly in the 2 years before she met Mark, a relationship that had ended, by Karen's account, amicably enough, though Talbot had reportedly taken the breakup harder than he let on at the time. Detectives learned of him through a neighbor who mentioned, almost in passing, that Talbot had called the Sorenson house twice in the months before the disappearance, calls Karen had described at the time as an ex-boyfriend failing to fully accept the relationship was over, nothing more. Talbot was interviewed twice, his alibi for the night in question, a work shift at a manufacturing plant 2 counties over confirmed by a time clock and 3 co-workers, holding up cleanly enough that he was cleared within the investigation's first month, though the coincidence of his brief reappearance in Karen's life so close to the disappearance nagged at Sheriff Whitaker for years afterward. A loose thread that never fully connected to anything, but that he could never quite convince himself to stop wondering about. It would turn out, decades later, once Karen's own secret finally surfaced, that Talbot's calls had nothing to do with anything, an ordinary, sad footnote to an ordinary breakup that simply happened to occur in the same autumn as an extraordinary tragedy. Roger Voss, Maddie's father, carried his own quiet guilt through those years as well, replaying obsessively the state of his boat cover that morning, the undisturbed dew on the canvas that had, in hindsight, been the single clearest piece of evidence in the entire case that the scent trail ending at his dock was a deliberate misdirection rather than a genuine drowning, a detail he hadn't thought to flag with any urgency at the time because grief and shock had left him barely able to answer basic questions, let alone recognize the significance of dew patterns on his own fishing boat. He would tell Rachel Osei, nearly 2 decades later, that he'd spent years wondering if a sharper, calmer version of himself might have noticed something that morning that could have cracked the case open decades sooner. A question Rachel gently assured him had no satisfying answer, because the misdirection had been built, deliberately and expertly, by people with far more experience at disappearing. Children than any grieving father could ever have been expected to see through. Then, in the winter of 2023, a woman named Patricia Kelso in Ohio, who had recently taken an at-home DNA test out of nothing more than idle curiosity about her family's ancestry, a gift from her adult son the previous Christmas that she'd nearly forgotten to mail in, uploaded her results to a public genealogy database that allowed users to search for potential relatives. Within days, the platform flagged a match, an unusually strong one, suggesting a close family relationship, likely a half-sibling or first cousin, to a user account registered under the name Emily Colton, a name Patricia had never heard in her life and could find no trace of anywhere in her own family records, no matter how far back she searched. Curious and a little unsettled by a connection that made no sense against anything she knew of her family tree, Patricia sent a message through the platform, and when weeks passed without a reply, she posted about the strange, unexplained match in an online genealogy forum devoted to helping people untangle exactly this kind of family mystery, mentioning almost in passing that the account listed a location history tracing back to a small town in Minnesota she'd never heard of called Hollow Pine. Patricia's post sat largely unnoticed for nearly 2 weeks, buried among dozens of similarly confused genealogy questions from strangers hunting for great-grandparents and half-forgotten cousins, the kind of low-traffic mystery that usually resolves itself quietly or never resolves at all. A moderator on that forum, who happened to also follow several true crime communities in her spare time, recognized the name of the town immediately, having read about the Sorenson disappearance years earlier during a deep dive into unsolved Midwestern cases that had kept her up long past midnight more than once, the kind of case that lodges itself in a certain type of person's memory and never quite lets go. She reached out privately to Patricia, then to Rachel Osei, whose name still appeared as a contact on an archived local news article about the case that had somehow survived nearly 2 decades of internet link rot, forwarding screenshots of the DNA match and the account name with a message that read simply, "I think this might be your missing girl." Rachel, sitting at her kitchen table on an ordinary Tuesday evening, nearly 2 hours from Hollow Pine, read that message 3 times before she trusted herself to believe what it might mean. Her hands, she would later admit, shaking too badly to type a reply for almost 10 full minutes. Rachel Osei, now a detective with a larger regional department, requested a formal subpoena for the genealogy platform's account records within days, a process that took nearly 6 weeks to clear the necessary legal hurdles. Weeks Rachel spent unable to sleep more than a few hours a night, running the old case file in her mind over and over, the flip-flop, the scent trail, the bolted door, wondering if this might finally be the thread that made all of it make sense. She drove out to Hollow Pine twice during that waiting period, sitting in her car outside the old Sorenson house, now owned by a young family who had no idea the significance of the address, and once outside Mark Doyle's hardware store, watching him through the front window ringing up a customer's purchase, deciding both times against telling either of them anything until she had something more solid than a stranger's forum post to offer. When the records finally arrived, they revealed an account created in 2019, registered to an email address tied to a name that did not exist in any state's birth records before that year. A pattern Rachel recognized immediately from her training in cold case work, the digital fingerprint of someone living, deliberately and carefully, under an identity built from nothing, a ghost address, a ghost history, a life that appeared to begin, on paper, at 25 years old with no childhood behind it at all. The account's IP login history showed logins clustered almost entirely around a single geographic region in the Pacific Northwest, occasionally shifting for what looked like short work trips, a pattern consistent, Rachel noted, with someone holding down an ordinary, stable job rather than living the kind of constantly mobile, evasive life true fugitives usually maintain, a detail that struck her strange until she considered that whoever built this identity might have believed, after so many years, that they were no longer being actively hunted at all. But that wasn't the only lie the records would reveal. Cross-referencing the account's billing information against a national property database, Rachel traced a residential address in a small town outside Bozeman, Montana, registered to a name that matched the account holder, Emily Colton, 29 years old according to the birth date listed on her state identification, an age that lined up, with unsettling precision, to a girl who would have turned 29 that same year had she survived whatever happened to her in October of 2005. Rachel sat with that number for a long time before she trusted herself to act on it, running the math 3 separate times as though it might somehow come out different. She drove to Montana herself rather than request a welfare check through local police, unwilling, after everything she'd read in the old case file, to risk spooking whoever was living at that address into vanishing a second time, checking into a motel 2 miles from the address, and sitting in her car outside the house for the better part of an afternoon, watching for any sign of the woman who lived. There, rehearsing in her head, over and over, exactly how she might begin a conversation that could shatter or heal 18 years of grief, depending entirely on what she said in the first 30 seconds. She waited 2 full days before knocking, watching the house from a careful distance, noting the woman's routine. A jog most mornings, groceries on Tuesday, lights out by 10 most nights, an ordinary life that gave Rachel no easy way to guess what conversation waited behind that door. She thought, more than once during that long, cold surveillance, about turning around and driving home, about the very real possibility that she was about to detonate a life this woman had spent decades quietly building, that showing up with a badge and an old case file might do more harm than the silence ever had. But she thought too of Karen Sorenson's kitchen table, the folder updated every autumn for 18 years, and of Mark Doyle's photograph behind the register, and she made herself walk up that porch anyway. The house was a modest single-story rental on a quiet street lined with cottonwood trees just beginning to turn, and the woman who answered the door, when Rachel finally worked up the resolve to knock 2 days after arriving in Bozeman, bore a resemblance to Lily Sorenson's age-progressed photograph so striking that Rachel later admitted she had to steady herself against the porch railing before she could speak at all, her badge suddenly feeling heavier in her jacket pocket than it ever had before. The woman introduced herself, warily, arms crossed against the cold, as Emily, and it took nearly 40 minutes of careful, gentle conversation on that porch, Rachel choosing every word with the caution of someone diffusing something rather than investigating it, before she agreed to sit down with Rachel inside, and nearly 2 hours more, 2 cups of tea gone cold on the coffee table between them, before she finally, haltingly, began to tell a story that would reshape everything Hollow Pine believed about the night Lily Sorenson disappeared. Emily spoke slowly at first, testing each sentence before she let it out fully, watching Rachel's face for any flicker of disbelief, any sign that telling the truth after 18 years of practiced silence might be the mistake she'd always feared it would be. She described a childhood spent moving twice more after Montana, a mother, Karen, who visited under careful, staggered arrangements that never happened more than twice a year, and always through methods Emily hadn't fully understood until she was old enough to ask real questions. A father she'd met for the first time at 16, a quiet, watchful man who cried the entire first hour they spent together, in a diner outside Spokane, and who she'd only recently learned to call Dad without feeling like she was trying on a word that didn't quite fit. Emily spoke slowly at first, testing each sentence before she let it out fully, watching Rachel's face for any flicker of disbelief, any sign that telling the truth after 18 years of practiced silence might be the mistake she'd always feared it would be. She described a childhood spent moving twice more after Montana, a mother, Karen, who visited under careful, staggered arrangements that never happened more than twice a year, and always through methods Emily hadn't fully understood until she was old enough to ask real questions. A father she'd met for the first time at 16, a quiet, watchful man who cried the entire first hour they spent together in a diner outside Spokane, and who she'd only recently learned to call Dad without feeling like she was trying on a word that didn't quite fit. She described, too, the strange loneliness of growing up as someone else's careful invention, birthday parties in 3 different towns, friendships she was taught, gently but firmly, never to let get too close, a recurring dream well into her 20s of a telescope and a window and a house she couldn't picture clearly enough to ever be sure it was real memory rather than something she'd built out, of half-remembered fragments and longing. She had asked Gordon Pratt more than once as a teenager why she couldn't simply go home, why the danger that had taken her away in the first place couldn't ever seem to end, and Pratt, she said, had always given her some version of the same careful, unsatisfying answer. That some threats don't have a clean expiration date, that the men who might still be looking for a connection to her father had long memories and longer patience, and that the cost of being wrong about safety was a cost measured in a child's life rather than a few more years of an imperfect, hidden one. The man everyone had assumed simply abandoned Karen Sorenson and her infant daughter in the early 90s, Lily's biological father, had not, in fact, abandoned anyone at all. His real name, Rachel would eventually confirm through federal court records unsealed only after extensive legal wrangling, was Daniel Reyes. And in 1993, as a young accountant working for a mid-sized logistics company in Duluth, he had uncovered evidence of a large-scale embezzlement and money laundering operation run through the company by men with far more dangerous connections than anyone at the company let on publicly. Daniel had cooperated with a federal investigation, testifying against 3 men eventually convicted on racketeering and fraud charges, and had been placed, along with a new identity, into the Federal Witness Protection Program in 1994, the same year, according to records Rachel pieced together, that Karen had told everyone in Hollow Pine her husband simply walked out. It wasn't a lie exactly, Emily explained quietly on that porch in Bozeman, watching Rachel's face carefully for a reaction. It was the story Karen had been given by federal marshals as cover, the explanation that would raise the fewest questions in a small town, and one that Karen had, over the following decade, come to believe served everyone better than the truth, protecting Lily from a danger neither of them fully understood the shape of. Someone was still watching, even years after Daniel Reyes disappeared into a new identity. And that was the terrifying detail that had, according to Emily, changed everything on a cold October night in 2005. In the months before the sleepover, Karen had begun receiving strange, unsettling contact, a hang-up call from an unfamiliar number that rang twice and vanished from the caller history entirely. A car she didn't recognize parked at the end of her street for 3 consecutive evenings. A man at the grocery store who seemed, in the particular way you notice these things without being able to prove any of it, to be studying her a beat too long. She'd mentioned none of it to Mark, unwilling or unable to explain a fear rooted in a marriage that predated him entirely. But she had, in a moment of genuine terror, reached out through a federal contact she'd been given years earlier for exactly this kind of emergency, a retired U.S. Marshal named Gordon Pratt, who had helped relocate Daniel back in 1994 and who had, in the years since, maintained a quiet, off-the-books willingness to help families in similar situations who had, for one reason or another, fallen through the gaps of an official program never designed to protect the families left behind rather than the witnesses themselves. Pratt confirmed Karen's fears within days, one associate of the men Daniel had testified against, having recently been released from federal prison, and having, according to intelligence, Pratt still had access to through old contacts, begun asking pointed questions about Daniel Reyes's whereabouts, questions that had, disturbingly, started circling closer to Hollow Pine than anyone could explain by coincidence alone. Pratt's assessment, delivered to Karen in a phone call she would later describe as the most terrifying 20 minutes of her life, was blunt. If these men believed harming, Lily might draw Daniel out of hiding, or might serve as retribution for a decade-old betrayal. Her daughter was in more danger sitting in her own bedroom than she would ever be anywhere else on earth, Karen asked him. She told Emily years later, whether she could simply call the police, whether local law enforcement or even the FBI's Minneapolis field office might be able to protect them properly through official channels, and Pratt had told her something she never forgot. Official channels move at the speed of paperwork, and paperwork has never once outrun a man who has already decided to hurt a child. Karen made the decision, in the span of little more than a week, working with Pratt and, through him, quietly reconnecting for the first time in over a decade with Daniel Reyes himself, now living under yet another identity in the Pacific Northwest, to disappear Lily entirely, to erase her so completely from Hollow Pine that anyone hunting for a connection to Daniel would find nothing at all. No daughter, no leverage, no thread left to pull. Daniel, when Pratt reached him with the news, reportedly did not hesitate for even a moment, telling Pratt to do whatever needed to be done, that he would rather lose every remaining connection to a daughter he'd never truly gotten to raise than risk her life for the sake of keeping her close. The sleepover at the Voss house, entirely Maddie's idea, coincidental and unplanned by Karen in any way, had presented an opportunity Karen felt she couldn't refuse. A night when Lily would not be in her own home, not in a location anyone watching Karen's house would think to surveil, giving Pratt's contact a clean window to move a child without anyone tracing the disappearance back to the Sorenson house directly. They had been looking at the wrong mystery from the very beginning. There had been no stranger at that lake, no predator lurking near the Voss dock. There had been a mother, terrified beyond reason, and a federal handler with the means to make a child disappear cleanly enough that even an experienced search and rescue bloodhound would find nothing but a scent trail that simply, deliberately, ended at the water's edge, because that was exactly where Pratt's boat, dark and quiet, had waited that night to carry Lily across the lake to a car parked on a rarely used Forest Service road nearly 3 miles from the nearest house. The starfish flip-flop, Emily explained, had been left deliberately, planted the following day by one of Pratt's associates, a man who had once worked in evidence disposal before retiring into Pratt's informal network, chosen specifically for how well he understood exactly what forensic examiners would and wouldn't be able to determine about a shoe's exposure to water, to suggest drowning rather than abduction, steering the investigation toward tragedy rather than toward any theory that might eventually connect back to witness protection, corruption, or a federal informant's hidden family. He had selected a flip-flop rather than a sneaker precisely because Karen had once mentioned in an old, unguarded conversation with Pratt years earlier that Lily loved swimming and kept a drawer full of beach sandals, a detail meant to feel painfully, convincingly authentic to anyone who found it, right down to matching a pair Karen still owned in a slightly larger size that the associate had photographed, from a distance to guide his choice. It had worked exactly as intended for 18 years, redirecting an entire county's grief toward a lake that had never held any part of the answer at all. Rachel Osei sat with this story for a long moment on that porch in Bozeman, turning over in her mind everyone in Hollow Pine who had spent nearly 2 decades living inside a grief built on a lie, Mark Doyle keeping a photograph behind his register for a daughter who had never actually drowned, Corey Voss carrying the weight of a suspicion that had cost him friendships and, eventually, his hometown. Over a disappearance that had nothing to do with him at all, Roger Voss replaying the state of his boat cover in his mind for 18 years without ever understanding what it had actually meant. Patricia Hollis keeping a photograph on her refrigerator for a student she assumed had been taken by violence rather than saved from it. Rachel thought, too, of her own younger self, 22 years old and fresh out of the academy, standing at the edge of that same lake in 2005, believing, along with everyone else, that somewhere beneath that gray water was a truth simply waiting to be recovered by a diver's hands, never once imagining that the truth had, in fact, been driving north through the darkness that same night in the back seat of a car belonging to a man neither she nor anyone else in Hollow Pine had ever heard of. The massive revelation reshaped everything the audience and the town had believed for 18 years. There had been no monster in the water. There had been a mother trying, in the only way a broken, unofficial system had left available to her, to save her daughter's life. But someone was still watching, even now, and the story was not quite finished unraveling. When Rachel pulled Gordon Pratt's full history, working alongside federal investigators brought in once the case's true scope became clear, she discovered Emily Colton, formerly Lily Sorenson, was not the only child Pratt had quietly relocated over the years. A cold case from 1998 in eastern Washington. A 9-year-old boy who vanished from his own backyard under circumstances federal investigators at the time attributed, without much confidence, to a stranger abduction, bore signatures Rachel recognized immediately once she compared the files side by side. A scent trail that ended abruptly at a body of water. A small planted item meant to suggest drowning. A family with a quiet, unexplained connection to an old federal witness case that had gone cold years earlier for reasons nobody had thought to question. A third case, still under review by the time Emily's story became public, involved a teenage girl in Idaho whose 2011 disappearance had been quietly reclassified as a runaway case within weeks, despite her family's insistence that she would never have left willingly. A classification investigators now suspected had been deliberately encouraged by someone with access to exactly the kind of official channels. Pratt's network had learned to move through undetected for years. Pratt, now 71 and living quietly in Arizona, had spent the better part of 3 decades running an entirely unofficial, unsanctioned protection network for families the formal witness protection program had abandoned or endangered. A network built on genuine, if legally catastrophic, compassion for children. He believed the system had failed, recruiting a small, loyal circle of former marshals, retired detectives, and at least one forger with a talent for building convincing identity documents from nothing, all of them bound by a shared conviction that the official program's rigid rules left too many families exposed once a threat resurfaced years after their initial relocation. He was arrested in early 2024 on charges related to obstruction of justice and interference, with multiple investigations spanning 3 states, though prosecutors, weighing the extraordinary circumstances and the documented threats against each family he'd helped, ultimately negotiated a plea agreement that avoided the lengthy federal trial Pratt's advanced age and health made increasingly unlikely to survive. Pratt gave a single statement to investigators before his health prevented further cooperation, saying only that he had never once relocated a child he didn't believe was in genuine, documented danger, and that he would make every one of those choices again, even knowing it would eventually cost him his freedom. Karen Sorenson was located within weeks, still living in Hollow Pine, having quietly maintained contact with her daughter through a series of increasingly careful, encrypted channels over the years. A secret she had carried in complete isolation, unable to tell Mark, unable to tell anyone, watching her ex-husband grieve a daughter she knew every single day, was alive and safe somewhere 3 states away. When federal investigators finally sat her down, Karen wept for nearly an hour before she could speak, telling them she had rehearsed the confession so many times in her head over 18 years that she'd almost forgotten what the actual truth sounded like out loud, rather than as a script she recited silently to herself at 2 in the morning. She described, in halting fragments, the specific cruelty of watching Mark's grief from the outside for 18 years, sitting across from him at their own divorce mediation, at community events, at the grocery store on ordinary Tuesdays, knowing every single time exactly how to end his suffering with a single sentence and choosing, every single time, silence instead, because Pratt had made clear that even one careless slip, one grieving husband confided in during a weak moment, could be the detail that finally got Lily found by the wrong people. She told investigators that the hardest year had been 2009, when Mark, 3 years divorced and still keeping that photograph behind his register, had asked her directly, over coffee at the diner, whether she thought Lily was dead, and Karen had made herself say the word maybe, watching something break further behind his eyes, understanding in that exact moment that she was choosing her daughter's safety over her ex-husband's ability to grieve cleanly, a trade she made without hesitation every single year and regretted every single day regardless. Emily, for her part, made the decision, slowly and on her own terms, to reach out to Mark Doyle directly, a choice that took nearly 4 months of therapy and careful preparation before she felt ready to make the call. Mark, 61 years old by then, still running the hardware store, still keeping that photograph behind the register, answered his phone on a Tuesday afternoon to a voice he hadn't heard in 18 years, a woman who still, even as an adult stranger to him now, called him Dad in the first sentence she spoke, and Mark would later say he sat down on the floor of his own stockroom and stayed there. For the better part of an hour, unable to stand, unable to speak, simply listening to a daughter he'd mourned for nearly 2 decades tell him, gently, that she was alive, that she was safe, and that she was so sorry it had taken this long for anyone to be allowed to tell him the truth. He closed the store early that day for the first time in 11 years, taping a handwritten sign to the door that simply read, "Family emergency, back tomorrow." A sign customers would later learn, once the story broke publicly, had marked the single happiest afternoon of Mark Doyle's entire life rather than any emergency at all. In the weeks between that first phone call and the visit itself, Mark told almost no one the full truth, unsure how to explain a resurrection to neighbors who had spent 18 years quietly grieving alongside him, settling instead for telling his closest friends only that Lily had been found alive, safe, and that the rest of the story would have to wait until he understood it well enough himself to say it out loud without his voice breaking halfway through. He spent those weeks in a strange, suspended state, unable to sleep more than a few hours at a stretch, pulling the old photograph from behind the register each night to study it as though searching for some sign in her 11-year-old face of the woman he was about to meet. Terrified in a way he hadn't let himself feel in years that he might somehow fail to recognize his own daughter. Or worse, that she might look at him and see only a stranger who had happened to marry her mother once. Karen, for her part, spent those same weeks in a different kind of reckoning entirely, sitting across from federal investigators and, eventually, a shaken but forgiving Mark, trying to explain 18 years of silence to a man who had every right to hate her for it, and who, instead, after the initial shock and anger finally burned through him, told her only that he understood, in the end, exactly why she'd made the choice she made, and that he only wished she'd trusted him enough to make it together rather than alone. Their divorce, finalized 15 years earlier over what both had assumed at the time was simply the slow erosion of unbearable grief, took on an entirely different weight in hindsight. A marriage that hadn't failed so much as been quietly sacrificed, one more casualty of a secret too dangerous to share with the person Karen loved most after her daughter. Emily flew to Hollow Pine 3 weeks later for her first visit back to the town she had no conscious memory of, standing outside the hardware store for nearly 10 minutes before she could make herself walk through the door, and finding, when she finally did, that Mark had rearranged the front counter that morning so that the old class photograph and the framed picture of her as a child sat side by side, facing the entrance, the first thing anyone would see walking in. Neighbors who had known both families for decades stopped by throughout that afternoon, drawn by word moving fast through town the way it always had, standing awkwardly near the paint counter, unsure whether to celebrate or cry, mostly doing both at once, and Patricia Hollis, Emily's old 4th grade teacher, arrived still wearing her school lanyard from that day's classes, hugging a former student she hadn't seen since she was 11 years old, and telling her, through tears, that she'd always known, somehow, that a mind that curious couldn't simply vanish from the world. Daniel Reyes, Lily's biological father, agreed to a single supervised interview with federal investigators, providing testimony that closed several loose threads in the original 1994 case and confirming every detail of Karen's account. He and Karen, reunited now not as former spouses but as two people bound permanently by an impossible choice they'd made together under threat, remained in careful, limited contact, a relationship neither of them fully knew how to define after so many years of enforced distance. Daniel told investigators that he had spent every one of those 18 years believing his own decision to testify back in 1993 was the single reason his daughter had been forced to disappear, a guilt he carried so completely that he had never remarried, never had other children, structuring his entire adult life, he admitted, almost like a penance he owed a daughter he could never fully explain himself to. Emily kept the name Emily, unwilling to surrender the only identity she had ever truly grown up inside after 29 years of building a life around it, though she began, slowly, rebuilding a relationship with both Karen and Mark on terms entirely her own, terms that made room for grief, for anger, and eventually, haltingly, for something like forgiveness. She finished her graduate degree the following spring, choosing, in a decision she said felt inevitable once she understood her own history, a specialization in family reunification work, telling a reporter who eventually interviewed her that she wanted to spend her career helping other families navigate exactly the kind of impossible, love-driven choices that had defined every year of her own life, without her ever fully understanding why. Corey Voss, tracked down at 52 and living 3 states away in a life he'd rebuilt slowly and deliberately far from Hollow Pine's long memory, learned of the truth from a phone call he almost didn't answer, a Minnesota area code he no longer recognized after so many years away, and wept, he later admitted, not from relief exactly, but from something closer to a decades-delayed exhale. Finally, allowed to stop carrying a suspicion that had cost him friendships, a hometown, and years of quietly flinching at his own reflection whenever he imagined what people still believed about him. He drove back to Hollow Pine for the first time in over a decade the following spring, parking outside the old hardware store and sitting in his car for nearly 20 minutes before he could make himself walk inside, and found Mark Doyle waiting behind the counter, older now, grayer, but recognizing him instantly, coming around from behind the register to embrace a man he'd never once suspected of anything himself, the two of them standing together in a store that had, for nearly 2 decades, quietly held space for 2 very different kinds of unbearable waiting. Roger Voss, still living in the same house on Larkspur Lane where his daughter's best friend had vanished from an upstairs bedroom, finally took down the boat he'd never quite been able to bring himself to sell, despite selling almost everything else that reminded him of that autumn, donating it instead to a youth sailing program 2 towns over, telling the volunteer who came to collect it only that it was time that he'd spent 18 years replaying the dew on its canvas cover, and he was finally ready to let someone else use it for something joyful instead of grief. News of the case's resolution reached Hollow Pine on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in early 2024, nearly 2 decades after Lily Sorenson had vanished from a lakeside house 4 houses down from her own. The diner on Hollow Pine's single commercial street, where the same handful of regulars had debated the case over coffee for most of 2 decades, fell into a stunned, disbelieving quiet when the story broke on the regional news. Sheriff Whitaker, 83 years old by then and living in an assisted care facility 2 hours away, was called personally by a former deputy who felt he deserved to hear it from someone who'd known him rather than stumble across it on a television screen, and he reportedly sat in silence on the phone for nearly a full minute before finally asking, in a voice thick with disbelief, whether the GER remembered any of them at all. The town organized a small, quiet gathering at the same elementary school gymnasium that had once served as search headquarters. Not a celebration exactly. Nobody quite knew what to call a reunion built out of 2 decades of grief, but a kind of communal exhale that let an entire community set down a weight it had carried in one form or another since October of 2005. Rachel Osei retired from active detective work within the year, telling colleagues she'd finally closed the one file that had followed her since her very first year on the job. The Sorenson case solved not by a confession or a body, but by a stranger's idle curiosity about her own family tree, a single DNA upload that unraveled a secret an unofficial protection network had spent 3 decades keeping, buried across at least 2 states. She kept on her desk until the day she cleared it out for good, a printed copy of the original search dog report from 2005, the scent trail that ended at the water's edge, a detail she'd never stopped thinking about until she finally understood, 18 years later, exactly what it had been trying to tell everyone all along. At her retirement dinner, colleagues asked her what she'd learned from a career bookended by a single unsolvable case, and Rachel said only that some of the truest acts of love look, from a distance, indistinguishable from the cruelest possible crime, and that the job of a good investigator was never to stop asking questions simply because the first answer felt complete. Sometimes the truth doesn't disappear. It simply waits, quiet as a scent trail at the water's edge, for someone willing to keep looking. Thank you for watching. If this case fascinated you, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more incredible crime and mystery stories. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and never stop asking questions.